The wedding bells had barely faded when Amelia realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had married the man she loved with all her heart, Daniel, a charming, ambitious businessman who had swept her off her feet with grand promises of love and forever. But forever, as it turned out, came with conditions. Conditions Amelia hadn't foreseen. She had always known she wasn't what society considered beautiful. She wasn't tall and lean like the models Daniel admired in magazines. Her features weren't delicate. Her skin bore the faintest scars from childhood acne, and her hair, though thick, never quite fell into the elegant waves Daniel preferred. But she had something else: warmth, intelligence, and a heart so full of love that she thought it would be enough. It wasn't. Not for Daniel. At first, the insults were small, disguised as jokes. A passing comment about how lucky she was to have him. A snide remark about how she could try a little harder with her appearance. Amelia laughed them off, thinking they were harmless. But then the comments turned into something sharper, more deliberate. "You know, sometimes I wonder how I ended up with someone like you," Daniel said one evening, swirling his wine glass as he examined her like a flawed sculpture. "I mean, I could have had anyone. But I married you." Amelia felt the sting in her chest but swallowed her pride. "I thought you married me because you loved me," she said softly. Daniel chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Love? Sure. But let's be honest, Amelia. If you weren't so plain, maybe I wouldn't have second thoughts every time we step into a room full of beautiful women." That night she cried herself to sleep. But it wasn't the first time. As the months passed, Daniel's cruelty grew bolder. He no longer whispered his discontent behind closed doors. He laughed about her in front of his friends, comparing her to the polished, glamorous women who threw themselves at him. "She tries," he would say, shaking his head. "God bless her, she tries. But you can't turn a rock into a diamond, can you?" Amelia felt herself shrinking. She stopped looking in mirrors, stopped dressing up, stopped believing she could ever be anything more than what Daniel saw her as: a disappointment. But then something happened. It started with a whisper inside her, a voice she had silenced for too long. A voice that said, "You are worth more than this." One night, after another humiliating dinner where Daniel openly flirted with a younger, stunningly beautiful woman in front of her, Amelia made a decision. She wouldn't fight for Daniel's love anymore. Well, he would fight for herself. As Daniel slept, oblivious to the storm he had created inside her, Amelia sat in front of the mirror she had avoided for years. She looked at herself, truly looked. Yes, her skin wasn't flawless. Yes, she had imperfections. But there was something else there too. Strength. The next morning she did something she hadn't done in years. She enrolled in a gym, started researching skincare, and took up a hobby she had always been passionate about but had abandoned: fashion design. She knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the woman Daniel had buried under years of ridicule. But fate had something else planned. Because the day Amelia finally saw herself in the mirror and smiled was also the day Daniel's perfect world began to crack. And he had no idea that the woman he had so cruelly discarded was about to become the very thing he would regret losing for the rest of his life. The first morning of Amelia's new life felt strange. As she stood before the mirror, her fingers traced the lines of her face, the same face Daniel had once called forgettable. But today she didn't see a woman trapped in self-doubt. She saw something new. Determination. She had spent too many years believing she wasn't enough. Now she was ready to become the woman she had always wanted to be. Not for Daniel, not for anyone else, but for herself. Amelia started small. She committed to waking up early, running at the park before the city came to life. At first her muscles ached and she gasped for breath, but she pushed through. Every step was a step away from the woman Daniel had broken. Her diet changed, not to be thinner but to be stronger. She devoured books on health, beauty, and self-care, things she had once dismissed as shallow but now realized were forms of self-love. But the biggest change was her mindset. For too long she had let Daniel's words shape her self-worth. Now she replaced them with her own. Each morning she stood in front of the mirror and whispered affirmations to herself. I am beautiful. I am worthy. I deserve better. At first the words felt empty. But slowly they started to feel like truth. While Amelia was rebuilding herself, Daniel was unraveling. At first he didn't notice the changes in his wife. He was too consumed with his own life. His business, his colleagues, the women who constantly flattered his ego. But then something happened. One morning as he sat at the breakfast table scrolling through his phone, he glanced up and nearly did a double take. Amelia walked into the kitchen, her posture straighter, her skin glowing, her presence different. What's with you? He asked, frowning. Amelia poured herself a cup of coffee, ignoring the way he scrutinized her. What do you mean? Daniel narrowed his eyes. You're acting weird. She shrugged, taking a slow sip of her drink. I just decided it was time for a change. Daniel smirked. Trying to impress someone? Amelia met his gaze without hesitation. Myself. Something about the way she said it made Daniel uncomfortable. He had spent years molding Amelia into a woman who depended on him, a woman who needed his approval. But now, she didn't seem to care about his opinion at all. For the first time, a sliver of unease crept into Daniel's mind. Amelia threw herself into self-improvement with a passion she had never known before. She hired a personal trainer, learned about skincare, and revamped her wardrobe, not to please Daniel but to rediscover herself. She found joy in dressing up again, in wearing colors that made her feel alive. One day as she was heading out for a meeting with a client, her first as an independent fashion consultant, Daniel stopped her at the door. Where are you going? He asked, his tone sharper than usual. Amelia adjusted the strap of her handbag. To work. Work. Daniel scoffed. Since when do you have a job? She smiled, but there was something cool in her expression. Since I realized I'm capable of more than just being your wife. Daniel was speechless. He had never thought about Amelia having a life outside of him. And the fact that she was now pursuing something of her own made him feel uneasy. Don't be ridiculous, he said, shaking his head. You don't need to work. I take care of everything. Amelia's smile didn't waver. That's exactly the problem. And with that she walked out, leaving Daniel staring after her, a strange pit forming in his stomach. Over the next few months, Amelia flourished. Her confidence grew, and with it her presence became undeniable. People started noticing her. Friends who had once pitied her now admired her. Even strangers were drawn to her newfound energy. But the biggest surprise came when an old college acquaintance, Ethan Carter, reached out to her. Ethan had been a close friend during her university days, a man who had always seen Amelia's worth even when she hadn't. He was now a successful entrepreneur in the fashion industry and had seen some of Amelia's designs online. Amelia, he said over coffee one evening, you have real talent. Why haven't you pursued this seriously? She hesitated, then gave a small laugh. I guess I never thought I was good enough. Ethan shook his head. You're more than good enough. If you ever want to work together, let me know. I'd love to help you build something incredible. For the first time, Amelia felt the weight of possibility settle in her chest. She could do this. She could create a life of her own. But Daniel wasn't having it. The more confident Amelia became, the more desperate Daniel grew. He started coming home earlier, trying to charm her the way he used to. He brought her gifts, took her to expensive restaurants, things that once would have thrilled her. But Amelia was no longer the woman who had waited for his approval. One evening, as they sat at a restaurant, Daniel reached across the table, his expression softer than usual. You know, he said, his voice dripping with false warmth, I've been thinking, maybe we should take a trip together. Just the two of us. Amelia looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time in years she didn't feel small in his presence. Why? she asked simply. Daniel blinked. As we need time together. Things have been off between us. She tilted her head. Off? Or different? He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Amelia set her fork down and met his gaze with unshakable confidence. You don't like that I'm changing. You don't like that I don't need you the way I used to. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. Is it? She leaned back in her chair. Because for years you made me feel like I wasn't good enough. And now that I see my own worth, suddenly you're paying attention. Daniel's face darkened. That's not fair, Amelia. She smiled, but there was no softness in it. No, Daniel. What wasn't fair was how you treated me. And now you're realizing that the woman you spent years belittling is slipping away. His hand clenched into a fist on the table. He had always believed Amelia would stay no matter how he treated her. That she would always be his, because she had loved him more than she loved herself. But now that wasn't true anymore. And the worst part? He knew it was all his fault. As the months passed, Amelia's life only grew brighter. She took Ethan up on his offer and began designing professionally. Her confidence was magnetic, and soon, people in the industry started recognizing her talent. One evening, as she stood backstage at a fashion event where her designs were being showcased, her phone buzzed. It was Daniel. She stared at the screen, her heart steady. She hadn't seen him in weeks and she didn't miss him. Amelia took a deep breath, then hit decline. Daniel had once believed she would always be there, waiting for his love. But now he was the one waiting. And for the first time in his life he realized he had lost the best thing that had ever happened to him. The weight of silence filled Daniel's luxurious penthouse. He sat in his dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, staring blankly at the city skyline. He had never felt this way before. The feeling was foreign, unsettling, regret. He had spent years treating Amelia as if she were invisible, as if her presence in his life was a given. But now she was gone. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. Daniel had always believed he had control over everything. His business, his reputation, his relationships. And yet he had lost Amelia without even realizing it was happening. The woman who once clung to his every word, who once tried so desperately to please him, had become someone he no longer recognized. Or perhaps she had finally become the woman she was always meant to be. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing emptiness inside him. Everywhere he went he was reminded of her. One evening at a high-profile charity gala he spotted her. Amelia stood across the grand ballroom, engaged in conversation with a group of elite designers. She was dressed in an elegant, form-fitting black gown that accentuated her newfound confidence. Her hair, once worn in simple styles, cascaded in perfect waves over her shoulders. She looked breathtaking, radiant in a way that made his stomach twist. But it wasn't just her beauty that struck him. It was her presence. She carried herself with a grace and assurance that had been absent before. She laughed at something one of the designers said, her smile reaching her eyes. Daniel felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar. Jealousy. She didn't even notice him. For the first time in his life he wasn't the center of attention. She wasn't looking at him, wasn't waiting for his validation. He was simply happy. Determined to reclaim what he had lost, Daniel downed the rest of his drink and made his way toward her. Amelia. She turned at the sound of his voice, her expression unreadable. For a moment he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Nostalgia maybe, but it vanished just as quickly. Daniel. Her tone was polite but distant. You look incredible. Thank you. She offered a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. There was a time when Amelia would have blushed under his compliments, would have lit up at the mere sound of his approval. Now she stood tall, unaffected. Daniel cleared his throat. I was hoping we could talk. She glanced at the guests around her, then back at him. I don't think that's necessary. His chest tightened. Please. She hesitated, then sighed. All right. But make it quick. They stepped onto the balcony, the night air cool against their skin. Daniel searched for the right words, but for the first time he struggled. You've changed, he finally said. Amelia raised an eyebrow. And that surprises you? No, he admitted. I didn't expect it. She studied him for a moment before speaking. You never really saw me, did you, Daniel? You saw what you wanted me to be. And when I didn't fit that mold, you made sure I knew it. His throat tightened. I never meant to. She held up a hand. Don't say you didn't mean to hurt me. You did. Every insult, every humiliation, every moment you made me feel like I wasn't enough. It was all intentional. Daniel's fingers curled into a fist. He wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her she was wrong. But deep down he knew she wasn't. I was a fool, he admitted. I didn't appreciate what I had. And now, he exhaled heavily. Now I can't stop thinking about you. Amelia's expression didn't soften. That's not love, Daniel. That's regret. And regret isn't a reason to come back into my life. His chest ached at her words. He had expected her to be cold, maybe even angry. But her indifference hurt the most. I can change, he said desperately. I want to change. She shook her head. You want to change because you lost me. Not because you realized you needed to be better. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but Amelia stepped back. I have to go. He reached for her, but she didn't stop. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt powerless. In the days that followed, Daniel spiraled. The women he once entertained meant nothing to him now. The luxurious lifestyle he had built felt empty without someone to share it with. His colleagues noticed the change. His friends whispered about how distracted he had become. But he didn't care. Every night he found himself scrolling through Amelia's social media, watching as she thrived without him. Her designs were gaining recognition. He was traveling, meeting influential people. And then there was Ethan. Daniel clenched his jaw every time he saw a picture of them together. Amelia and the man who had stepped into her life just as he had been pushed out. They looked happy. Too happy. The realization hit him like a truck. She had moved on. And he was just a painful memory in her past. One evening, after too many drinks, Daniel made a decision. He drove to Amelia's apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had to see her. Had to make her understand that he was different now. When he arrived, he hesitated at her door, his heart pounding. Then he knocked. A few moments later, the door opened. Amelia stood before him, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair damp from a shower. She frowned. Daniel. He swallowed hard. I needed to see you. Her expression remained neutral. It's late. I know, he admitted. But I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend like I don't miss you. She sighed. Daniel. Please, Amelia, he interrupted, his voice raw. I was a terrible husband. I took you for granted, I made you feel like you weren't enough, and I will never forgive myself for that. She crossed her arms. What do you want from me? He took a step closer. A second chance. She didn't react right away. Instead, she studied him as if searching for something. And then she shook her head. No, Daniel. His stomach dropped. Amelia, please. You don't get to do this, she cut him off, her voice firm. You don't get to break me for years and then come back when you finally realize what you lost. He felt his throat tighten. But I love you. She exhaled softly. Maybe you do. But I don't love you anymore. The finality in her voice was like a dagger to his chest. Amelia offered him a small, sad smile. "Goodbye, Daniel." And with that she closed the door. Daniel stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the closed door, reality sinking in. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable, believing he could treat Amelia however he wanted and she would always be there. But now she was gone. And for the first time in his life, Daniel understood what true loss felt like. Daniel stood in the dimly lit hallway, staring at the closed door, his heart sinking into a hollow pit of regret. He had never thought this day would come, that Amelia, the woman he had once dismissed as ordinary, would be the one to shatter him so completely. He turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. His mind was a storm of memories. The way she used to look at him with admiration, the way she clung to his every word, the way she had loved him despite all the ways he had belittled her. Now she looked at him as if he were just another stranger. And maybe that's all he was now. Days passed, then weeks, and Daniel found himself slipping deeper into solitude. His once vibrant social life had lost its appeal. The women who once flocked to him now felt meaningless. He ignored their calls, their texts. None of them were Amelia. Work became his only distraction. He threw himself into meetings, deals, and expansion plans, but even then he couldn't escape her ghost. Every time he stepped into their old bedroom, he could still smell her perfume. Every time he sat at the dining table, he could still hear her laughter. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see her walking away. He had never understood how much she had truly meant to him, until she was no longer his. One evening, Daniel found himself scrolling through social media, something he rarely did. But tonight he was searching for her. And there she was. Amelia looked radiant, standing at a red carpet event, surrounded by celebrities and influential designers. She was wearing one of her own creations, a breathtaking crimson gown that hugged her curves perfectly. She looked nothing like the woman he had once mocked. She looked powerful. But what hit him the hardest was the man standing beside her, Ethan. Ethan's hand rested on the small of her back, his smile warm and genuine. And Amelia. Amelia looked happy. Truly happy. Daniel clenched his jaw, an unfamiliar wave of jealousy surging through him. That should have been him. That was supposed to be him. The realization that Amelia was slipping further away sent Daniel into a panic. He had to see her. Had to make her understand that they were meant to be together. Without thinking, he drove to the venue where the event was being held, determination burning in his chest. When he arrived, the sight of flashing cameras and elegantly dressed guests greeted him. He spotted Amelia almost instantly, laughing as she spoke with a reporter. Daniel pushed through the crowd, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Amelia." She turned, startled, as his voice cut through the chatter. Her expression shifted from surprise to irritation in a matter of seconds. "Daniel," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I need to talk to you." Ethan, who had been standing beside her, immediately tensed. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel shot him a glare before turning his attention back to Amelia. "Please. Just 5 minutes." Amelia sighed, glancing at Ethan before nodding reluctantly. "Fine. 5 minutes." She led him away from the crowd to a quieter corner of the venue. Daniel took a deep breath. "Amelia, I made a mistake." She crossed her arms. "You made a lot of mistakes." "I know," he admitted. "And I regret every single one of them." She remained silent, her gaze unreadable. "I didn't appreciate you," he continued. "I took you for granted and I made you feel like you weren't good enough. But the truth is, I was the one who wasn't good enough for you." Amelia's lips parted slightly as if his words had caught her off guard. Daniel took another step closer. I miss you, Amelia. I miss us. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Nostalgia maybe, but it disappeared just as quickly. You don't miss me, she finally said. You miss the version of me that needed you. Daniel flinched. That's not true. Yes, it is, she said, her voice steady. For years you made me feel like I was less than. You tore me down until I believed it myself. But I've spent too long rebuilding myself to let you drag me back. Daniel swallowed hard. I can change. She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Maybe you can. But it's too late. His stomach clenched. Amelia, please. She reached up, gently placing a hand on his cheek. For a brief moment he felt hope. But then she spoke. I loved you once, Daniel, she whispered. With everything I had. But love isn't enough when respect is missing. She pulled away and the loss of her touch felt like a final blow. I deserve more, she said softly. And with that she turned and walked away, back toward Ethan, back toward her new life. Daniel stood frozen, watching her go, his chest tightening with a pain he had never known before. For the first time in his life he truly understood what it meant to lose something valuable. And he had no one to blame but himself. Daniel spent the following weeks in a daze. Nothing felt the same anymore. He had spent his life believing that love was something he could control. That Amelia would always be there, waiting, hoping, loving him despite everything. But now he saw the truth. He had destroyed the love she had for him, piece by piece, with every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every moment he made her feel small. And now he had to live with that. One evening he found himself walking through the park where Amelia used to love to go. He sat on a bench, watching as couples strolled hand in hand as laughter filled the air. He had once had that. And he had let it slip through his fingers. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. Daniel. He turned, startled, and found Amelia standing a few feet away. She looked as stunning as ever, but there was something gentler in her expression. What are you doing here? She asked. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Thinking. She nodded, stepping closer. Are you okay? He let out a bitter chuckle. I don't know. For a moment there was silence between them. Then Amelia spoke. I never wanted things to end this way, she said. But I had to choose myself. Daniel met her gaze. I know. She smiled softly. I hope you find happiness, Daniel. I really do. His chest tightened. I hope you do too. Amelia nodded, then turned to leave. Daniel watched her go, knowing this time there would be no second chance. And somehow that was the hardest lesson of all. Amelia had spent years feeling like she was never enough. But now she was thriving. Her career had taken off in ways she never imagined. After partnering with Ethan, her designs were being featured in major fashion magazines, worn by celebrities and showcased at international runway events. The girl who had once been mocked for being plain, was now the woman shaping an entire industry. And with success came confidence. Confidence that was entirely her own. She no longer second-guessed herself, no longer sought approval from anyone else. Most importantly, she had found love again. A love that was patient, kind, and genuine. Ethan had been there from the start of her reinvention, but their relationship wasn't rushed. He saw Amelia for who she was, strong, resilient, brilliant. Unlike Daniel, he never tried to diminish her. He only encouraged her to shine. At first, Amelia was hesitant. She had spent so long being controlled in a relationship that she feared losing herself again. But Ethan wasn't Daniel. He never pushed. He never made her feel small. Instead, he waited, allowing her to come to him in her own time. And when she did, it felt effortless. Their love grew naturally through long conversations, shared dreams, and a mutual understanding of what it meant to truly respect one another. For the first time in her life, Amelia felt cherished, not as someone who needed fixing but as someone already whole. One evening, Amelia and Ethan attended an elite fashion gala in Paris. She wore a breathtaking midnight blue gown of her own design, her confidence radiating from every step she took. Ethan stood beside her, his hand gently resting on the small of her back, his presence steady and reassuring. "You know," he murmured as they sipped champagne, "watching you like this, I don't think I've ever been prouder." She smiled, tilting her head toward him. "And why's that?" "Because I know how much you've been through," he said softly. "And yet here you are. More powerful, more beautiful, more extraordinary than ever." Amelia felt her heart swell. "You always believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Ethan took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "That's because I saw you for who you truly were. And I still do." At that moment she knew she had found something rare, something Daniel could have never given her. A love built on trust. A love built on respect. A love she could finally believe in. Months passed and Amelia continued to rise. Her brand had expanded, her work was being recognized internationally, and she had finally built a life that felt entirely her own. And then Ethan did something that made her heart stop. One evening, during a quiet dinner at their favorite restaurant, Ethan took her hand across the table, his eyes filled with an emotion she had never seen before. "Amelia," he said, his voice steady but thick with meaning. "From the moment I met you, I knew you were different. Not just because of your talent or your beauty, but because of your heart. You are the strongest, most remarkable person I have ever known. And I don't want to spend another day wondering what life would be like without you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Amelia gasped as he opened it, revealing the most elegant ring she had ever seen. Classic, timeless, just like their love. "Will you marry me?" Ethan asked, his voice full of certainty. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. Not because she hadn't expected this moment, but because for the first time in her life she was choosing love. Not out of desperation, not out of fear, but out of pure, unwavering happiness. "Yes," she whispered before laughing through her tears. "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, sealing their future with a kiss. A future that was hers to embrace. The wedding was nothing short of magical. Held in a stunning garden overlooking the ocean, it was a celebration of love, resilience, and new beginnings. Amelia walked down the aisle in a gown of her own design, elegant, graceful, a reflection of everything she had become. As she met Ethan at the altar, her heart raced, not with fear but with excitement. She had once walked down an aisle feeling unsure, feeling like she had to prove something to the man waiting for her. But not this time. This time she was walking toward a man who already saw her as enough. Vows were exchanged, promises made. Ethan took her hands in his and said, "I will love you not just in the grand moments but in the quiet ones. In the successes and in the struggles. In the ordinary and the extraordinary. You are my heart, Amelia, and I vow to cherish you for the rest of my life." Amelia felt tears slip down her cheeks. When it was her turn, she looked into his eyes and said, "I have known love before, but I have never known love like this. A love that makes me stronger. A love that reminds me I am whole, all on my own. I choose you, Ethan, today and every day after." With that, they sealed their vows with a kiss, and cheers erupted around them. The woman who had once been mocked, belittled, and broken was now standing at the center of her own fairy tale. Not because she had found a man to complete her, but because she had completed herself first. As the years passed, Amelia and Ethan built a life together filled with adventure, passion, and mutual respect. They traveled the world, grew their business, and most importantly, never lost sight of what truly mattered: each other. "And Daniel," He remained a distant memory. A lesson Amelia had learned, a mistake she had grown from. There was no resentment left, no anger. Only the knowledge that she had once loved someone who never truly saw her, until it was too late. And that was his burden to carry. Amelia had moved forward. She had built a life that was hers. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Viv.